The forest began feeding before we crossed the tree line. I know that now. I did not know it then. Then, I was only aware of the smell, something between overripe fruit and open wounds, sweet rot and iron, rising from the undergrowth as our Valkyrie banked hard over the canopy, and the pilot swore under his breath, and I gripped the restraint harness and told myself the trembling in my hands was turbulence. I was wrong about that too. My name is Adjunct-Surveyor Caelum Veth, attached to Explorator Expedition Rho-Twelve, tasked by the Adeptus Mechanicus with preliminary assessment of the world-designated Morthaulix VII. I was 31 standard years of age. I had surveyed 6 death worlds in 11 years of service. I had survived them all by knowing the rules. I had read every filed assessment report, every survivor testimony, every biologist catalogue my clearance permitted. I knew how to read a kill zone. I knew how to read an environment. I did not know how to read a forest that read me first. This is my testimony, recorded at the 42nd hour following extraction, dictated to data slate while my hands still refused to stop shaking, while the bioluminescent residue still traces the veins of my forearms in faint violet lines that the Medicae assure me will fade. I am not certain I believe them, but that is the testimony that matters, so I will begin there, with what I knew, and what I failed to understand, and the 11 hours between those two things that made corpses of 7 of my team. We landed at 16th hour by ship's reckoning, 2 hours before local sunset. The forest designation on the surveillance grid read, Zone Theta Noctis. Previous expedition notes, sparse, 3 years out of date, described bioluminescent flora. Standard Death World category classification, Xenos adjacent, verdant, predatory. I had processed that classification the way I processed all classifications, as a professional, with methodical respect. I briefed the team, I distributed gear, I checked my lumen pack, my data slate, my field kit. I made note of the temperature, 19 degrees at landing, dropping rapidly. The sky to the east was already darkening from grey to deep amber. Adjunct Medicae Racine Colt checked her biologis scanner and reported the atmospheric composition clean, breathable, no toxins at threshold concentration. I told the team we would establish base camp at the forest margin and push survey probes at first dark. Nobody argued. We were professionals. We had rules. The rules failed us. At the 43rd minute, I should describe what the forest looked like before it showed us what it was. I think that matters. I think the beauty matters, because it tells you something about how the universe is built, and not one thing that it tells you is comfortable. At 19 degrees, the forest was dark. The canopy overhead was interlocked, dense as manufacturum vaultwork, layers of broad fronds and knotted branch limbs crossing and recurving until the sky above was memory. The trunks were ancient and pale, smooth-barked, the color of old bone, and between them the undergrowth was thigh-deep, broad-leafed plants with waxy surfaces, ground-runner vines with hollow tendrils, not fungi clustered on exposed root structures. Nothing moved. Nothing made sound. I noted the silence as interesting, recorded it, moved on. Then the forest lit. It happened in sequence. First, the fungi along the root structures, they pulsed once, deep violet, and went out. Then the undersides of the broad leaves, the same deep violet, holding longer, fading slow. Then the hollow tendrils of the ground-runner vines, and these did not pulse, but rather flowed, color moving along their length like current through wire, violet tipping to a cold blue-white at the nodes where they intersected with other plants. The transition from dark to glow took perhaps 20 seconds. When it stabilized, the forest looked like the inside of something biological. Not decorative, not beautiful exactly, though it was beautiful. It looked functional, like illumination inside a living body. Racine Colt made a sound of involuntary appreciation. I remember that clearly. She was dead before the 9th hour. I am trying to tell this in order. It is difficult to tell this in order, because the forest did not reveal itself in order. It revealed itself in layers, each one worse than the last, and understanding came to me the same way, not as a single realization, but as accumulation. Discovery compounding on discovery, until the weight of all of it was sufficient to change the shape of what I was looking at entirely. At the 43rd minute, Tech Adept Morvain recorded the first anomalous reading on his biologist instruments. He called me over. His voice was professionally neutral. He pointed to the readout and said simply, "The emission spectra from the bioluminescence is responding to biological proximity." I studied the readout. The violet emission intensified measurably when any member of the team passed within approximately 4 meters of a plant cluster. It faded when they moved away. "Motion triggered," I said. Morvain's mechadendrites clicked softly against each other, which was the closest he came to expressing uncertainty. Possibly. But the response is non-uniform relative to proximity. 2 team members at equivalent distance produce different intensity responses. I cannot rule out biochemical trigger. I looked at the readout for another moment. Then I noted it in my data slate, assigned it a classification flag for further investigation, and moved the team deeper into the survey zone. This is what I wish I could explain to you. The professional mind is a mechanism for the management of uncertainty. You cannot stop work every time something is anomalous. Everything is anomalous on a death world. The job is to collect data sufficient for pattern recognition, then act on the pattern. I had not yet collected sufficient data, so I moved us forward. By the 91st minute I had the pattern. I wish I had understood it then. I did not understand it then. The pattern was this. The bioluminescence intensified around individual team members at irregular intervals that correlated with no movement they made and no proximity to specific plant species. Morvain tracked 5 of these events across 4 different team members and brought me the data. The intervals were irregular, the intensity varied, but the correspondence was real. Something was triggering the light that was not position, not motion, and not species proximity. I recorded it as stimulus response unknown, flag, high priority. Pending investigation, we made camp at the 2-hour mark. The light around us was constant now, the deep violet of the canopy interwoven with the cold blue-white of the ground vines, and I found myself adjusting to it the way you adjust to any light source. Noting it, ceasing to note it, proceeding. Survey teams eat in cycles. I ate my field ration at the designated time. The food tasted of synth protein and promethium residue from the heating element, the same as it always tasted, and I ate it in the same methodical way I always did, and I was proud in some small and professional way that I was maintaining routine. The forest pulsed 3 times while I ate, not a sustained glow, a pulse. 3 distinct intensifications of the violet light, spreading from a point approximately 6 meters to my left, propagating outward through connected plant tissue, the way a shockwave propagates through hull plating. I wrote, possible periodic biological rhythm, respiratory analog, investigate. The first death came at the 4-hour mark. His name was Hellas Von, scout rank, experienced, 12 years field service. He had been conducting the perimeter check alone, which was inside protocol which I had authorized, which I had considered safe. The perimeter was 30 meters from camp. The forest at 30 meters looked identical to the forest at camp. Pale trunks, wax-leafed undergrowth, ground-runner vines pulsing cold blue-white between their nodes. We heard him hit the ground. We did not hear him scream. This is the thing I could not make sense of for a long time afterward. There was no scream. There was the sound of his boots on the underlayer of root mat, the soft rhythm of his perimeter walk, and then a single sharp intake of breath, and then nothing, and then the sound of his body meeting the ground. Racine Colt reached him first. I reached him 12 seconds later. He was lying on his back in the undergrowth, between 2 root clusters, and the vines were already threading through his gear, and the expression on his face was not pain. It was surprise. His eyes were open and the violet bioluminescence reflected in them, and for one moment, before Racine said, "He's not breathing," I thought he was simply startled, simply looking up at the canopy in professional wonder. His neck had been punctured at the carotid. The wound was small, clean-edged. The thorn that made it was ill present. approximately 6 centimeters, translucent, hollow, connected to a vine runner that disappeared into the root cluster beneath him. The vine was pulsing. Not violet, a deep, slow crimson, moving from the wound site inward along the vine's body, like watching something drink. The forest had drunk from him. I stood over Hellas Von's body for a period of time I did not record. I should have recorded it. I am a surveyor. I record everything. I stood over him, and the forest pulsed 3 times in slow violet, and I was aware, in a part of my processing that was below professional reasoning, that the light was more intense here than it had been moments ago. Racine Colt looked at me. The thorns are the feeding apparatus. The bioluminescence must be the attractant, I said. We need to understand the trigger mechanism. She said, we need to get back to camp. She was right. I did not fully understand why she was right for another 40 minutes. I believed at that point that the danger was the thorns themselves, that we needed to avoid physical contact with the vine runners, that careful movement would keep us safe. I believed the forest was a passive predator, like the pitcher plant analogues of other death worlds, environmental, mechanical, triggered by proximity and physical contact. I was wrong in a specific way that killed 7 people. The forest was not triggered by proximity, it was not triggered by motion, it was not triggered by contact, it was triggered by fear. I know this sounds like something from a priest's sermon. I know it sounds like the kind of metaphorical truth that gets told about death worlds in hive-hab recreation halls, by veterans who want to seem profound. I am a surveyor. I deal in measurable data. So I will tell you in measurable terms what the data showed, and you will understand why, by the 6th hour, I was sitting in the center of camp reciting inventory manifests in my head, not to calm myself, but as a survival technique. Morvain identified the trigger at the 4-hour 30-minute mark. He had been comparing the records of the bioluminescent anomalies we had noted in the first hours against the physiological data from the team's monitoring equipment, pulse rate, respiration, epinephrine markers that the suit sensors tracked for medical purposes. The correlation was absolute. Every anomalous bioluminescent intensification we had recorded corresponded to an epinephrine spike in a team member. Not large spikes. The data registered them as minor events, the kind of low-level cortisol and epinephrine production that accompanies unfamiliar environments. Wariness, unease, the body's unconscious response to darkness and strange light and the smell of open wounds under sweetness. The forest was feeding on that. Not the blood, Morvain said. He was looking at his readout with the focused stillness of an adept encountering genuinely anomalous data. The blood is the secondary resource. The bioluminescent response is the primary mechanism. The plant tissue is reading biochemical markers. Exhalation, skin conductance through suit micropermeability, possibly airborne cortisol compounds. I said, it's detecting stress response. Detecting and amplifying. The bioluminescence is not an attractant for prey approach. It is a stimulus. The light triggers continued stress response in prey organisms. The stress response produces biochemical output. The biochemical output intensifies the light. The intensified light produces increased stress response. He paused. His mechadendrites were very still. A feedback loop. Each cycle draws the thorns. I looked at the camp around us. The violet light between the root clusters was brighter than it had been 2 hours ago. Not dramatically. Suddenly. He temperature drops, without you marking it, until the cold is already inside you. Every light in that forest was measuring us. Every pulse of the vine nodes was drawing the thorns toward elevated biochemical markers. Hellas Von had died not because he walked too close to a vine runner. He had died because something in the forest startled him, raised his cortisol by measurable fractions, and the vines fed on that signal and drove their thorns toward the source of it. The perimeter check had taken him away from other team members, away from the averaging effect of multiple biochemical signals in proximity, and the forest had focused on him alone. We need to leave, I said. We cannot reach the extraction zone without moving through the forest, Morvain said. Yes, Moving through the forest at elevated cortisol levels will trigger increased thorn pressure. Yes, to traverse the forest safely, we must maintain suppressed fear response across the entire team for approximately 6 hours of movement. Yes, I said. Racine Colt had been listening. She said, very quietly, "How do you make 6 people not afraid in a forest that eats people?" That was the question. That was the correct question, the one that the rest of the 11 hours turned on, and I wish I could tell you I had a good answer for it. I had a procedural answer. I had the only answer that a surveyor's training offered. But I want to be honest about what it felt like to implement it, because I think the feeling is the part of this testimony that matters. And if I reduce it to procedure, I will have failed to testify truly. The answer was, you don't make them not afraid. You can't. Fear is not a switch. It is a physiological state, biochemical autonomous, running below the threshold of rational intervention in its early stages. You cannot order the adrenal gland to stand down. You cannot. Will cortisol suppression. What you can do is give the mind something else to run. I gathered the team. 5 remaining members. I told them with flat professional precision exactly what the forest was, how it triggered, what the feedback mechanism was, and what we needed to do to survive the traverse. I used the data. I showed them the readouts. I spoke in the same tone I use for standard briefings, because I have learned over 11 years that people respond to calm voice as a signal that calm is possible, even when it is not. The tone is the message. If the message is panic, people panic. If the message is procedure, people execute procedure. I could feel my own heart rate at the edge of what the suit monitors registered as elevated. I recorded this as data and set it aside. We will move in a tight formation, I said. We will maintain verbal contact at all times. I will lead narrative. I will describe aloud what I observe in front of us. You will respond with confirmations. We are not making conversation. We are giving our cortical processing something to occupy. The goal is not calm. The goal is cognitive load sufficient to suppress autonomic stress response at the margin required. Private Scout Cale Auric, youngest member of the team, said, "You want us to talk our way out." "I want us to think our way out," I said. "Talking will help the thinking." We left camp at the 6-hour mark. The extraction zone was 3.4 kilometers through Zone Theta Noctis. In clear terrain, on a quiet world, that is 60 minutes of steady movement. In thigh-deep undergrowth, in a forest lit by violet predator light, in formation with 5 people trying to suppress their own biological survival response through sheer cognitive effort. It was 6 hours. I will tell you what those 6 hours were. Not all of them, but what they were. The floor of the forest was oat uniform. The root mat varied in depth and composition. In some areas it was firm enough to walk on cleanly. In others it gave underfoot like saturated peat, and when it gave, there was always a moment of physical surprise. The body dropping 2 or 3 centimeters without warning. And that surprise produced a cortisol spike of exactly the kind the forest monitored. So we moved slowly. I described the terrain ahead in a steady, flat voice. Morvain confirmed. Racine confirmed. The others confirmed. We were doing inventory of the ground we were walking on. We were cataloging root structures and vine node positioning and canopy density. We were doing the work of professional surveyors, and the work was the armor. At the 73rd minute, a vine runner crossed the path directly ahead of me. I stopped. I described it. Hollow tendrils, approximately 8 centimeters diameter, crossing left to right between 2 root clusters, pulsing cold blue-white at the nodes. I described the gap between it and the root structure to its left, approximately 90 centimeters, sufficient for single-file passage. I described stepping through. The vine pulsed as I passed, once violet, and I noted the pulse and described it, and stepped through and felt my heart rate in my throat and kept talking. At the 104th minute, Racine Colt stopped responding to confirmations. I turned. She was standing 2 meters behind me, and she was looking at something to her left, and she was not responding to my voice. I could see, even in the violet light, the change in her posture. the small collapse of control that happens when a person's cognitive process is overloaded by the thing it was trying not to see. The thing she was looking at was a thorn, extended from the vine runner to her left, drawn toward her, still 3 centimeters from contact, translucent, hollow. The vine it me redged from was not violet. It was the deep, slow crimson of a vine actively engaged in feeding. It had found her cortisol spike. She had stopped moving, and the stopping had increased her cortisol, and the increased cortisol had drawn the thorn closer, and the thorn being closer had increased her cortisol, and the loop was closing. I said her name. I kept my voice flat and professional. I said, Racine. Survey report. What is the composition of the root mat to your immediate right? She looked at me. The thorn moved approximately 1 centimeter closer. Root mat composition, I said. Survey report. Give me a professional assessment. She blinked. She looked at the ground. I watched her do it. Watched her pull the cognitive process back from the edge it had been tipping over. Watched her give her mind the data-gathering task in place of the terror-processing task. She said, in a voice that was almost steady, root mat composition suggests high organic turnover rate, significant moisture retention, recommend marking as unstable footing for secondary survey teams. The thorn stopped moving. In 14 seconds, it began to retract. We stood very still while it retracted fully. The vine pulsed violet 3 times and faded back to blue-white, and the crimson drained from it slowly. When it was gone, I said, confirmed, and turned, and we kept walking. I do not know how to explain what it costs to do that. To choose, in the presence of something designed to trigger your survival response, to override the survival response by making yourself professionally useless. To treat mortal threat as data, to look at a thorn drawing toward your arterial blood, and make yourself curious about root mat composition. The human nervous system is not built for it. It fights you. Every second it fights you. The fear exists because it is functional, because it is supposed to make you run, or freeze or fight, and instead you are making inventory notes and keeping your voice at a neutral register, and trusting that the inventory notes will save you when everything your body knows says they will not. This is not courage. I want to be clear about that. Courage, as I have understood it in 11 years of Death World surveys, is willingness to act in the presence of fear. What the forest required was something different. The willingness to act in the presence of fear while systematically dismantling the fear itself, while treating the fear as the enemy rather than the forest, while turning the full force of your professional training against the part of yourself that most wanted to survive. You had to make the fear more dangerous to acknowledge than the thing you feared. The forest punished recognition. It punished the moment your body admitted it was in danger. And so you had to become, for 6 hours, something that did not admit it. I lost 2 more team members before the 2-hour mark. Scout Auric triggered a vine cluster response in an area of dense ground runner concentration that Morvain and I had assessed as possible. He had been maintaining excellent cognitive discipline for 80 minutes. He passed between 2 root clusters in exactly the way I had described. The vine runners activated in a pattern I had not anticipated, not from 1 node, but from 3, in triangulated response, the thorns emerging simultaneously from different angles. He saw them. He broke discipline for 3 seconds. 3 seconds was sufficient. I pulled the thorn from his neck before he hit the ground. The wound was non-fatal. The blood loss was manageable. Racine stabilized him in 4 minutes. He could not walk. I made the calculation that I wish I did not have to describe. The extraction zone was 2.1 kilometers ahead. Carrying Auric was possible, but wool. D reduced movement speed by 40% and would require 2 team members to support him, reducing the cognitive load each could manage for their own biochemical suppression. 3.5 hours additional exposure. I ran the numbers. I ran them twice. I said, we'll take turns carrying him, Racine and I rotating every 15 minutes. Morvain looked at me with the flat assessment of an adept running the same calculation and arriving at the same place I had gone and then stopped. The additional time, he said. Noted, I said. We carry him. We carried him. The second death was tech specialist Orvian Chalk. He was 47 years old. He had 17 years of field service. He had 2 children on Hive Primus Calendrath, whose names I know because he had mentioned them in the pre-mission briefing, when I asked team members to state professional record, and one personal detail, as I always do, as I have always done, because I believe people survive better when they know each other slightly. Their names were Mira and Donnell. He had described them as a considerable professional liability in the sense that I intend to stay alive for them. He was maintaining his professional discipline well. He had been describing, in a low, steady voice, the structural properties of the root mat for 40 minutes. He was precise and observant and calm in the way that people with strong reasons to stay alive are sometimes calm. He stepped into a root cavity, the kind the ground runner vines use as water retention basins, hidden under the leaf litter, approximately 60 centimeters deep, and he went into the hip, and the physical shock of the drop, unexpected, unavoidable, triggered a cortisol response that the vine nodes within 2 meters registered within seconds. He had his head above the root cavity when the thorns reached him. I heard the sound I have heard a lot of. Sounds in 11 years of death world surveys, and I am not a person given to dramatic recall of them. But I hear that one still in the space between sleeping and waking. He said, "Survey report confirmed," before he lost consciousness. I do not know if he was aware of what he was saying, or if the training ran on after the thinking stopped. I hope the former. I believe it was the latter. It does not matter. Either way, I heard him say it, and we kept moving. I am trying not to let this testimony become a list of the dead. I know how those testimonies read. I have read them in 11 years of post-mission assessment. They become inventory. They become their own kind of professional record, and the professional distance that makes them useful is the same distance that makes them false, because it strips out the weight of what each name means. The 17 years, and the 2 children, and the voice keeping steady in the violet dark. So I will say only this. By the 10th hour, we were 4. Myself, Morvain, Racine, and Auric, who was largely unconscious but whose vital signs Racine monitored with steady professional attention. The others are in my report. They are also in my memory, which is not the same document and does not follow the same filing conventions. The forest, at the 10th hour, was magnificent. I want to tell you this because I think it is the most important thing I have to testify. The forest was magnificent. The canopy above us was a vault of cold fire, violet and blue-white, living light propagating through connected tissue, in waves that were almost rhythmic, that looked from below like breathing. The root structures rose around us like buttresses. In a great cathedral, their surfaces traced with bioluminescent lichen that pulsed in slow response to our presence. The ground-runner vines glowed at their nodes, like stars mapped along constellation lines, cold and precise and beautiful. The smell, which I had noted as sweet rut and iron at landing, had become something else in the hours of traversal, something more complex. The sweetness still there, but underneath it something warm, animal. The smell of living process of growth and consumption, and the cycling of biological material from one form to another. I noted it in my data slate. I kept noting it because the noting was the armor. I described what I saw. I used the words a surveyor uses: canopy density, luminescent emission intensity, nodal spacing of ground-runner vine clusters. I described the cathedral light in technical terms. I did not let myself call it beautiful, because beautiful is not a surveillance term, and the moment I let my mind make the aesthetic response, I would be feeling something, and feeling something was what the forest was waiting for. This is what I mean when I say the forest required you to become something that did not admit it was in danger. It also required you to become something that did not admit it was in the presence of something extraordinary. That cost. I will not pretend it did not cost. I am a surveyor. The reason I am a surveyor, the reason I chose 11 years of death world assessment over administrative posting or hive-side research, is that I find the strangeness of things genuinely, viscerally compelling. I find the universe interesting in a way that is not reducible to professional utility. And for 6 hours, I was forbidden that. For 6 hours, I looked at one of the most singular biological mechanisms I have ever encountered. A bioluminescent predator forest that reads biochemical fear markers in prey organisms and uses light as a feedback amplifier to drive feeding thorns toward elevated cortisol sources. And I was not allowed to be interested in it. I was allowed only to catalogue it. There is a kind of grief in thee. A small grief, relative to the others, but present. At the 11-hour mark, at the 262nd minute of traversal, Morvain said, "Luminescence intensity decreasing." I looked. He was correct. The blue-white of the ground runner nodes had faded over the previous 10 minutes, so gradually I had not registered it. The violet of the canopy was softer. The pulsing of the connected tissue had slowed from the rhythmic wave propagation of the deep forest to something more sporadic, more scattered, like communication becoming difficult at range. The tree line was 40 meters ahead. I said, "Survey report. Final section." My voice was steady. It had been steady for 11 hours. I did not know, until that moment, how much effort that had cost, because I did not know until that moment that I was very close to the edge of the effort running out. Root mat composition in this section. Give me a full assessment. Racine Colt, supporting Oryx's arm across her shoulders, said, "Root mat composition shows significant reduction in moisture retention approaching tree line. Organic turnover rate decreasing, soil substrate visible at surface in patches. Recommend marking as stable footing for secondary survey teams." Morvain said, "Canopy density decreasing commensurate with tree line proximity. Ground runner vine cluster concentration reducing. Nodal spacing increasing." Oryx, barely conscious, said something that sounded like confirmed. I said, "Confirmed." Proceeding. We walked 40 meters. The forest diminished around us as we walked. The vines thinned. The canopy opened. The violet light faded back toward darkness, and the darkness was the darkness before dawn, and not the darkness inside a predator's throat. When we crossed the tree line, the air changed. The sweet rot smell remained for a moment, and then the wind took it. I stopped at the margin. I turned back. The forest was still lit. From outside it, at distance, you could see its full expression. The whole canopy glowing in slow violet waves, propagating in from the edges toward the center, like something breathing, like something waiting. The bioluminescence did not respond to us at this distance. We were no longer useful to it. I stood there for perhaps 30 seconds. I noted the time. I noted the luminescent intensity at tree line margin. I noted the wind direction and the ambient temperature, which had dropped to 12 degrees in the hours of our traverse. I noted the structural features of the tree line and the composition of the soil substrate at the forest edge. Then I said, still in the surveillance tone, still in the voice that had kept 4 of us alive by keeping itself empty, "Zone Theta Noctis. Final notation, do not enter without biochemical suppression protocol. Recommend full biologis quarantine pending complete assessment." This notation made by Adjunct-Surveyor Caelum Veth, Explorator Expedition Rho-Twelve, at the 11-hour 19-minute mark of traversal. I looked at the forest for another moment. It pulsed, slow and violet and indifferent. I said, "Survey complete." We walked to the extraction zone. The Valkyrie came 40 minutes later. The pilot did not ask about the missing members of the team, not directly, because pilots who fly deaf world surveys learn not to ask directly. And instead he looked at the 4 of us and at our biosigs on his display and said very quietly, "Everybody make it?" And I said no. And he nodded and did not speak again until we docked. This is what I want to leave on record, not as a surveyor's finding, but as testimony, the kind of thing that is not in the mission report because the mission report has no field for it. I do not know if the forest is sentient. The data does not support or refute it. Morvain believes the mechanism is purely biochemical. emergent behavior in a complex symbiotic organism, evolution having produced, over millions of years, a feedback loop of extraordinary efficiency, with no more intent behind it than a pitcher plant has intent when it waits at the bottom of its digestive pool. I am inclined to agree. The universe is full of things that seem to choose and do not choose, things that seem to watch and do not watch, things that seem designed for specific cruelty and are simply designed for efficiency. But I will tell you what it felt like, not as data, as testimony. It felt like the forest had a theory about us. It felt like the forest understood something about what we were, what we could not help being, what we could not stop producing even in our most controlled and professional moments. It understood that we were afraid. That fear was built into us at the level of chemistry, that we could not remove it, only redirect it. And it had spent millions of years learning how to make something very small and distant and manageable into something large and immediate and overwhelming. It understood that the light would help, that the light would create the story of danger that the nervous system needed to produce the biochemical markers that the forest needed to feed. It had a theory about the nature of prey. The theory was correct. The 11 people on Explorator Expedition Rho-Twelve knew we were professionals. We knew the rules. We knew how to read environments. We knew how to survive death worlds. 7 of us died anyway, not because we were not good enough. Because the forest was not trying to beat us. It was not competing. It was simply doing what it had always done. What it had done for millions of years before we arrived. What it would do for millions of years after we left. It waited for us to feel something. And we were human. We felt something. We tried very hard not to. We recited inventory manifests and survey protocols and technical assessments of root mat composition. And for some of us, the recitation was enough. And for some of us, it was not. And the ones for whom it was not are in the mission report and not in this Valkyrie. I have been thinking, in the 42 hours since extraction, about what it means to survive something by refusing to respond to it. I have been thinking about the cost of that refusal. The forest required us to not be afraid, and we could not comply with that requirement, so it required us to be afraid without showing that we were afraid, which is not the same thing, but is close enough for survival purposes. And I am not certain what it does to a person over 11 hours to hold that distinction. I know my hands still shake. The medici say this is cortisol residue, neurological fatigue, the accumulated cost of hours of suppression. They say it will pass. I believe them in the medical sense. In the other sense, I am less certain. The violet lines in my forearms are fading, they assure me. Morthaulix VII is, by standard classification, a death world-rated category vermis. Predatory flora, significant casualties on first contact, recommended for either full biologist's quarantine or development of biochemical suppression protocol prior to second survey. I have filed the report. I have filed all the reports, Hellas von, Orvian Chalk. Their names and the names of the others are in the casualty section. Filed, cross-referenced, entered into the ledgers of Explorator Expedition Rho-Twelve as professional losses, which they were, and as something that does not have a field in any ledger I have ever processed, which they also were. The forest will be there when the second survey team arrives. It will be glowing. It will be waiting. It will be reading the air for cortisol and epinephrine and the 10,000 other biochemical signals that the body produces without consent. It will be beautiful. It will be indifferent. It will be the same as it always was. I have one professional recommendation beyond the standard quarantine notation. If you go into that forest, do not wonder at it. Do not feel anything about it. Not the beauty, and not the horror, and not the grief of walking out without everyone you walked in with. Give yourself the technical vocabulary and stay inside it. Call the light bioluminescent emission. Call the thorns feeding apparatus. Call the dead losses. Do not call them by their names. I am Adjunct-Surveyor Caelum Veth, and I am telling you this not because it is in the mission parameters, but because I have been writing mission reports for 11 years, and none of them have ever saved anyone. This is the only testimony I know how to give that might, There is something in that forest that knows what you are. The only way through it is to know it first. Testimony recorded and archived. Explorator Expedition Rho-Twelve, Post-Mission Assessment Record. Dictation by Adjunct-Surveyor Caelum Veth. Biologis Facility 7, Transit Vessel Perseverant Duty, 42nd hour post-extraction. Classification, Surveillance Record, Restricted Access, Biologis Xenoflora Division. Do not distribute beyond clearance level Iota Vermis without authorization of Expedition Command.